Hello and welcome to the Supernatural track here at Continual. Today we're talking about Not Without My Brother, relationship problems, traumatic bonding, codependence, attachment disorder, all those messy Winchester things that go with relationships. But before we dive into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Lynn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor at Westchester University, and my research area is fandom, and especially the fandom of Supernatural, which is the show that I love, obviously. So I've written lots of books on that show, including a couple with the actors and the fans of Supernatural, Family Don't End with Blood, and There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. And I have a new book coming out on The Boys that's a deep dive into that show, which happens to have a chapter by Kaela.
Way, woo, Kaela.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Kaela Joseph. I am also a clinical psychologist out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and I wear many hats at a few different places, mostly in LGBTQ plus healthcare. And my area of research is also in fandom, specifically fandom as social movements and fandom and queer representation.
Very good. And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. But all of the modern worlds are ones Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. I don't have degrees in this. I'm just an obsessed fan. So let's talk about all those messy relationships. And you know, with Sam and Dean, the mess is kind of everywhere. So it's between them, it's with others, it's with John, it's with Mary. There's just more than enough mess to go around. Not counting angels, demons, and the king of hell. But let's start with traumatic bonding and that nuclear family that gets burned to a crisp. How does that lay some of the groundwork for where the boys go after that? Lynn?
Well, I mean, at the very core, what happens to the poor Winchester family is that the attachment relationships of both Sam and Dean get disrupted by what happens with the yellow-eyed demon and then the loss of Mary. So it's interesting because it impacts the two brothers very differently because they were very different ages when that catastrophic event happened. So Dean had, 4 years of, by all accounts, a really nice upbringing. He probably had a secure attachment with both of his parents, at least from as much as we know. It seems like that was the case from the glimpses that we see. And then everything just got yanked away in an instant. So for Dean, that initial secure relationship does help him sort of, it keeps him somewhat grounded. It lets him keep going. It facilitates his relationships with other people. But because of the sort of inconsistency in that relationship, in that everything got disrupted by that catastrophic event, he sort of ends up, instead of with a secure attachment, with kind of what we call an anxious ambivalent attachment, where he's kind of hyper vigilant about his attachment relationships. But Sam gets 6 months of that nice secure bonding, but that's a lot less than 4 years. So Sam has that catastrophic event happen very early on, and so he ends up with a different attachment status than Dean, I think leaning a little more toward an avoidant attachment, where you're used to be disappointed by people and not getting your needs met, and you become pretty self-sufficient and independent because you're afraid to count on other people to fulfill those needs. So I think one of the most interesting things is that they are very different. That's what the whole show hinges on, that Sam and Dean are so different. And a lot of it comes down to the ages that they were and that really early childhood experience.
Okay, Kaela?
I think the other thing that's really interesting about this show is that we get to confront that disruption in ways that are not really possible in a non-supernatural world. We get Mary coming back, and now Dean in particular has to confront this actual version of his mother and not the attachment that he made to sort of the idealized version of his mother before he really knew her as a person and only knew her as an attachment figure. And then we have Sam, who never got to form much of an attachment with Mary, also having to negotiate that. And when there's the rupture in their relationship with Mary, I thought it was a very interesting choice to have Sam very much side with Dean and not defend his mom in that. And similarly, we get glimpses of that with John. We don't get to have quite the same longer arc as we did with Mary, but we do get the wish where he comes back, and we get to see sort of a moment of reconciling some of that with him.
There's that wonderful quote in, I think it's Clap Your Hands If You Believe, where Sam tells Patchouli Girl he lost his mother when he was very young, and she said, "Oh, I'm very sorry." And he says, "No, we met up later in life, and it turned out okay." And, only on Supernatural. So how does that avoidant and ambivalent tendency work between the brothers? Because Dean is always kind of hanging on really tight to Sam, and Sam comes back. He loves Dean, but he's also able to walk away at times, and that's something Dean doesn't really forgive him for being able to walk away, at least not for a long time. So how does that play into this initial programming with the attachment, Lynn?
Well, it's really interesting because, there's some research out there on what types of attachment, people with certain classifications of attachment, the people that they tend to have relationships with. And you don't really often see people with the anxious ambivalent attachment paired up with somebody with an avoidant attachment. So, but of course, Sam and Dean are brothers. And so that their relationship is what it is. And they love each other because they're brothers and for many other reasons. But that's a fraught thing for them, because their needs, because of their different attachment classifications, don't always really mesh very well. Dean does have that hypervigilance. Dean kind of expects abandonment. He had his mother, he had his father, he had that sort of utopian relationship, and then it was yanked away from him. So he's always worrying that he's going to be abandoned again. And that plays out in his relationship with Sam by him being really overprotective, far into the time when Sam is a 6'5" grown man who can fight off all kinds of monsters. But to Dean, he's still worried about being abandoned by Sam, even if it's not Sam walking away, but Sam dying. Any type of abandonment is a fear for Dean. So he tends to be really overprotective. But Sam, who had to grow up even as a young child being very independent, not just from that initial attachment loss, but then the way John raised them after that, Sam was often left on his own. That's the reason we see Sully as an attachment figure for Sam later on. Sam learned to make do. So for Sam, that's got to chafe a little bit when you're a grown man who has left the family to establish yourself, to go to school, to become an independent person, but then your brother just keeps seeing you as someone who needs to be protected all the time and who's constantly saying, "Are you going to leave me? Are you going to leave me? Are you going to leave me?" Never in words, of course, but played out in all of Dean's behavior. So, again, this is the difference between real life and a television show, because that makes for fabulous television. There's constant friction between Sam and Dean in the early seasons because of this. In real life, that would make for a really fraught relationship that maybe would be best discarded and found another relationship, but it makes for great TV.
They definitely do seem to, especially in those early seasons, just hit each other in the pain points, and kind of bring out the worst in each other sometimes. Kaela?
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about Supernatural also going on as many seasons as it did, is we start to see that shift a little bit over time. We start to see both of them in different ways. Sam a little more so directly with words, Dean a little more so with actions, as is the usual. But we start to see them voice what they need. We start to see Sam say, I'm here, I'm not leaving. And if I stay, I need certain things from you. I need you to see me as an adult. I need this from you. And we see Dean reciprocate that. And I think we see Dean also ask for things in different ways. There's also more introduction of other characters as we get into the later seasons. And so we get to see them develop attachments with other people, and we get to see them negotiate those attachments with other people, which I think frees up the brothers a little bit to be more secure in their own bonding, that they have these other people coming in and out. Not always. There's times like with Benny, for example, that gets quite disrupted. But particularly in the far later seasons, we see them really kind of stick together, and the conflicts tend to be with other characters because they've done some of that rupture and repair with one another.
Yeah, they actually do get better with their words, which was a wonderful thing to see the show let them do, because shows so often keep characters kind of in stasis. And Sam and Dean actually were allowed to grow up in many ways and find their words and not just repeat the same patterns quite as much. And you brought up Sully. I'm thinking about how hostile Dean was to him originally, like, hey, get away from my brother. But in the end, he apologizes for not being there when Sam needed him and appreciates Sully for giving Sam what Dean couldn't. And that's a huge growth thing for Dean. And Sam finding his words and saying, look, if we're going to do this, we need to be partners. We need to be equals. I can't just be the little kid you're dragging around. And that takes a while to work out. But they do actually get to the point of being able to say that, which is a wonderful thing. Now, even Zachariah the angel said that the Winchesters were neurotically, erotically codependent. And that charge comes up time and time again. What can we say about Winchester codependence, and where does it come from? Lynn?
I mean, it comes from the damage that they sustained in that, it comes from exactly what we've been talking about. They both ended up with insecure attachments, and that makes for relationships that are either hanging on too tight or pushing away and avoiding. There's all kinds of things that come with it. Difficulties with emotion regulation. Both of the brothers have a problem with that. They tend to get angry. They tend to, especially Dean, use substances. They both tend to get super involved in work, which is hunting, as kind of an escape from thinking about anything else or making relationships. But I do think, I think it is really important to remember that they do make progress. When we think of the early seasons, Zachariah's comment is widely like, sometimes Supernatural throws things in there, and I wonder if they just sat around afterwards going, what are the fans going to make of this? They just give you just this little throwaway line, and everybody's like, wait, what now? What was that? But it is really interesting in the beginning that they are so entangled, especially Dean with Sam, but Sam too, in this like reciprocal tangled thing that they've got going. In the beginning, even Dean is constantly like trying to set Sam up with women, like constantly, don't you want to stay with her? Don't you want to stay with her? You need to hook up. You need to get laid. However he puts it, he's constantly trying to push Sam away from him in a constant testing of, is he going to come back? Is he still going to prioritize his relationship with me, or is he going to have, a healthy relationship maybe and go have a romantic relationship, which is, again, if this was happening in real life, you'd probably want to sit down with these people and say, okay, let's talk about what's going on here. But for television, that's amazingly twisted and codependent and just makes for wonderful television. It does, as Kaela said, I think get very different by the end of the show, in that their repertoire of people in their life expands, and there's other people who they consider even family, that they pull into that family group that they prioritize so much. But the interesting thing about Supernatural is that never does take away from the primary bond between Sam and Dean, which I think is really unusual because that's a platonic bond in canon. And yet that is the one that ends up being the one that's prioritized. So interestingly, they have this amazing journey from these really messed up attachments to coming to something by the end of the 15th season that is working for them and is pretty healthy and allows them to have other relationships but still keep their bond. That was pretty brilliant of a long game that Supernatural played pretty successfully.
Okay, Kaela?
Well, and I was just thinking to that point about how Dean tries to set Sam up with others. When he stops doing it with Sam, he starts doing it with Cass.
Yes, he does. He can't help himself. Whenever
Yeah.
he's a little bit insecure still, he's like, I'm going to push you away. Are you going to come back? Are you going to come back?
One of the things that has fascinated me about fan response to Supernatural, I read a lot of post-canon and fix-it fix from the finale. And one of the things that folks focus on a lot is that idea of Dean's attachment styles, and particularly that push-pull, either with Sam or with Cass or with both of them. And this idea of Cass always came back. And in the end, it's the one time that Cass doesn't come back. And so I think fans are also really looking at and paying attention to whether the language is there for attachment style in the way that we're talking about it. Fans are really paying attention to how are these attachments being made and broken and reshaped over time. And, exactly to the point that you made, Lynn, it all comes down to trauma. You have this core relationship ripped away from you. In a way, you also have dad ripped away from you because he's no longer acting like dad. You would do everything in your power to either hold on to that or get the heck away from it. And they do that in different ways.
Well, and I've seen a lot of curtain fic that looks at that Sam came back with Dean in heaven, not with Amelia, not with Jess. Dean is with Sam, even though with the amount of time that's passed, Cassie could be in heaven, Lisa could be in heaven, and yet their heaven is still together, and nobody's really in a big rush to go see anybody else, which is definitely a theme through a lot of that curtain fic. Now, it's not that uncommon, especially when you think about teenagers, where you have maybe two best friends and then one of them gets a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and there's jealousy. There's, well, I wanted you to be happy, but I didn't want you to be that happy. Wait, I just lost you because now you're too busy for me. And that kind of tension that often happens between, do you put your friend first? Do you put your partner first? What happens here? Is because of their messed up childhood, did the Winchesters lag a little bit on that emotional development that, I'm thinking of having seen that a lot in high school. These guys are older than that when we start up with them. And yet some of those patterns remind me a lot of teenagers in that sense. Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, I think that insecurity for both of them, even though we see it play out in the more stereotypical way with Dean, but we see it with Sam every now and then too, like with the Benny situation, or it does get better as time goes on. But by when time goes on, it's 15 years down the road and they're men in their 40s. So it doesn't get better when they're 25 or 26 or 27. It doesn't get better until much later. But I think they also really struggle with romantic relationships. I mean, that's a different kind. They struggle with their own platonic relationships, certainly, but they also struggle with romantic relationships because they don't really trust romantic relationships to stick around either. Dean is pretty good at self-sabotage, which is something that you see in somebody with this kind of an attachment style. He certainly is good at attracting people and having one night stands, but he's not very good at sustaining relationships, mostly because he does something that sabotages them. You could say that Cassie maybe was the exception to that rule because he did make an attempt to stay in that relationship, but it also sounds like it was a pretty awkward attempt, and it sounds like just sort of spilled the truth on her out of nowhere, which may have actually been a way of self-sabotage, because who could be expected to hear something that sounds like your partner has lost their mind and just be like, oh, okay, that's why you have to leave a lot. You're killing demons. Okay, come back on Tuesday. I'll be here. So I think he did a lot of that self-sabotage. And Sam sort of convinced himself for a while that anyone he had a relationship with was in danger and was possibly going to die. So he too was going to be abandoned. And he kind of just put up a shield and decided not to try for intimacy with people because it was going to be bad for them, which again is another type of sabotaging relationships.
Yeah, supernatural fans would get it. Oh, you're demon hunting? Fine. See you next week. But, normal people, probably not. Kayla?
Well, and I think that also gets further complicated by the supernatural elements that are at play. So, for example, we see them try to negotiate some of those things with partners, but then, like with Lisa, for example, she actually does end up in danger and ultimately decisions are made. Same thing with Amelia. Sam walking away, was that actually the wrong choice, or was he not going to be all the way in if he stayed? And so I think the supernatural elements at play do kind of pull them in different directions and do pose a real threat to people that likely they would not be in harm's way if they were moving about the world, living their lives. And I think that's why we get sort of a different relationship down the road with Sam and Eileen. Eileen's already in the life. And so Eileen poses a very different kind of partnership where she's going to put herself in that danger no matter what. It stops giving Sam that excuse.
Yeah, you have to wonder all along, is it self-sabotage or is it just reality and acknowledging reality? Most of us don't have to, make that call because we're not hunting demons.
Well, and the closest I guess it comes in real life is somebody who might be in the witness protection program or has some other side of their life that they can't tell their partner about. And there's a real corrosion there just of having to constantly hide and lie, even if it's for the other person's protection. And Dean has thrown that up to Sam many times about, well, did you tell Jess what you really do? Where you really came from? And of course, the answer was no. So that factored in even then. We don't know how much he told Lisa before the monsters showed up. But that's a lot to handle even in real life. So yeah, definitely going to mess things up there. Now, what about the traumatic bonding with John? John, their mother's dead. John takes two little kids in the car and hits the road to hunt monsters and spends a lot of his time in the bottom of a bottle if he's not out killing monsters. What does that do to that bond between father and sons?
I mean, I think one of the interesting there's evolution in that relationship too, certainly as the series goes on. But I think one of the interesting things, especially in Dean's reaction and his bond with John, is that what happens when a child loses one attachment figure, one parent in this case, is their attachment to the remaining parent is intensified. I mean, this is the only parent that they have left. So there's a great attempt, and a lot of psychological gymnastics can go into codifying that relationship as, this is fine, this is strong, this is the parent I still have, they still love me, I have not been abandoned by both parents. So I think especially in Dean's case, but probably in Sam's case as well, especially when he was young, there's a lot of forgiveness of John because the boy, he's what they have. And he's the parent who's still there, who hasn't abandoned them. So even when, he's really, I'm a big fan of all the meta out there on John Winchester's A+ parenting, because that's irony. And he really was not an A+ parent. And there's a lot of forgiveness on the brother's part, especially Dean early on. You can see it in a heartbreaking example in the Christmas episode when Dean just does backflips trying to say, Dad would totally be here. Yes, it's Christmas. He would be here. He steals presents, and, tries to make up for it desperately, in part because he wants to hang on to this image of John as the good parent that they can still hang on to. So I think that really impacted both of their relationships with John over the years, but it did evolve. And I think it evolved in opposite directions, which so often happens with the brothers, with Dean seeing John more and more realistically as he became more and more secure in his other relationships, including with Sam. And Sam being a little more forgiving because he, as the avoidant child, rejected John in some way, and him coming to see that, as happens with, if you work with people who've had early attachment disruptions, a lot of the work is helping them to realistically see their parents as these flawed human beings who were dealing with trauma of their own, and that's why they became horrible parents. And that doesn't make it okay. It's not okay, and it's a terrible thing that no child deserves, but you can understand it in some sense, and that can be freeing for the adult child. And I think Sam goes through a lot of that understanding. And of course, as we've pointed out, because this is supernatural, we get to see these things that happen to real people. They happen even if the parent is deceased, but they don't happen with the parent magically coming back to your living room so you can have a conversation with them about it. So I love the way Supernatural brilliantly uses these real life things that happen, but because they have supernatural context, they can make it explicit. Oh, here's John Winchester back from the dead. Now Sam can have that conversation, which in therapy you'd be having with an empty chair or just talking about, but it's supernatural. We can have it in reality. I love that. I think that's awesome.
Well, Jake gets it with a shapeshifter therapist, which is
Exactly.
a whole new, opportunity out there. Kaela?
But I think we also get to see that really clearly, even with their subconscious and how they've internalized some of these things. So I'm thinking specifically of Dark Side of the Moon and their heavens, back when heaven is supposed to be reliving your best memories, and all of Dean's best memories are related to family. It's the sneaking away to have fireworks with Sam. It's actually quite sad, something happening with John. We then cut over to Sam, and Sam's best memories are somebody else's Thanksgiving. It's a time that he ran away. It's a time that he left the family to go to college. And so we get to also see how they've internalized these things, and then the rupture that happens between the two of them as they negotiate. Well, what does that mean? Obviously, you're not in control of what your heaven is, but to some degree, the meaning making that you've done, you're a little bit within your control over.
Which, of
See,
course,
I'm still with the headcanon that Zachariah messed with that to drive a wedge between them, and those weren't really Sam's memories, but that's my headcanon, and I'm sticking to it. Lynn?
I like that.
I was just going to say that, because it's supernatural, you have the additional complication of, were those Sam's? Would they have been? We don't know. We don't know what Zachariah did. If Zachariah did do that, you got to hand it to the guy. He was a bad guy, but he was brilliant. I mean, that worked so well. Even if he was messing with them, he knew enough about what was already going on internally in the brothers to know this is Dean's worst fear, that what is most important to Sam is not family. So, I mean, go Zachariah, if that was you doing that. That was well done.
Well, and the other piece that we have kind of overlaid on top of all these issues is Dean's very early parentification, which is made very explicit in the show. I mean, he's giving Sam the last of the Lucky Charms, and the implication is there isn't any other food in the kitchen. John's gone, and who knows when he's going to come back? Is there going to be enough money to eat? Who knows? So Dean had not even a normal suburban, hey, babysit your little brother, while I finish my shift at work kind of thing, latchkey kid. How does that parentification on top of all these other things, what does it do? Where does it intensify? Where does it gum up the works, Lynn?
I mean, I think, again, you use the word intensify, but that's right. Again, that intensifies Dean's protectiveness over Sam. also his idolization of John, and the fact that John gave him this overt command: take care of Sammy. That is your purpose in life. That is your identity. That is what you're here to do. Totally inappropriate for a 8, 9, 10, 12, whatever year old boy. Completely inappropriate. But Dean absolutely internalized all that as part of his purpose. And that served to intensify his protectiveness of Sam and his real struggle with seeing Sam as a competent grown up who could protect himself. So I think, again, unfortunately, that, and you could call that, I mean, now we've really transitioned over into neglect. That's absolutely parental neglect. John went over that line, I think, anyway. I don't know how many times, because we don't know from canon, but just from the little bits that we hear, it seems like quite a few times John went over that neglect line. And that just pushed Dean to be more over responsible for Sam, and yes, to feel parentified. So again, these external things also happen, that they fall right along the fault lines that are already there for the brothers, and intensify both the strength of their bond eventually, because they transcend all this and get through it, but initially just make for way more conflict between them.
Okay, Kaela?
Well, and in addition to that, I think we see that tendency with Dean kind of over and over again when kids are around. We see that Dean kind of is the person that kids latch onto. He's, able to talk to the kid who's not speaking in the early seasons and say, I also had a period where I didn't talk. You saw something really traumatic, and the kid kind of opens up to him. We see that with other like hunters' kids and kids in different scenarios. We see that a little bit with Ben, and then we even see it with there's something I've seen folks post on social media that I love, where it's a picture of Sam holding one of Garth's babies and a picture of Dean holding one of Garth's babies, and Dean is supporting the head and Sam's baby is all floppy, because when would Sam have held a baby? But Dean quite literally cared for Sam, and so of course Dean knows what he's doing in those situations, and kids tend to gravitate towards him.
Now, we also know that John's father disappeared when he was young. We now know what John never did, which was what happened to Henry. The Winchesters give us an alternate universe idea of what happened with John after his father disappeared, with a fantastic invented character of Millie in the garage. But we don't know what happened in the real supernatural universe to John, and whether his mother coped or didn't. Mary lost her parents traumatically. Bobby lost his parents traumatically. There's a theme here. How does that affect the intergenerational issues when it comes to all these attachment and codependence and bonding issues? Lynn?
I mean, I think it made both John and Mary, unfortunately, also more fragile when it came time for them to make their own attachment. So even though in their early years, it seems like they did do a really good job of kind of stopping that intergenerational transmission and creating a family that actually seemed to be working. As soon as there was some tragedy and some stress on that, John was unable to keep doing that. He fell apart. Perhaps, I mean, look, anybody would fall apart if your partner burned on the ceiling. I'm not judging John for his trauma response there, but what happened to him after, like the level of his compulsion and just being driven by revenge, and his inability to really parent very well at all for a long time, I think is because of his own history that did make him more vulnerable. And I think we also see that with Mary. When Mary comes back to life miraculously, she also really struggles. Again, I think anybody who comes back who died when you were in your 30s, and you come back confronted with grown sons in their 30s, where you never got to watch them grow up and you just left them in heaven as a 6-month-old and a 4-year-old, anybody would have trouble making that transition. But I think Mary has more trouble, and she really, really struggles to do it at all, and eventually just kind of avoids them and escapes and tries to throw herself into hunting with the British men of letters, with the rationalization of, I'm doing this for my sons to eventually keep them safe, when it's not something they asked for, it's not something they want, it's not the type of relationship they're looking for her. So she also struggles with that attachment relationship.
Okay, Kaela?
There's also an element of identity integration that is missing a little bit for both of them. Not only do they have this intergenerational trauma, but they very much kind of divorce themselves from their pre-family identities for those first few years. So Mary, doesn't talk about hunting, and like we get a glimpse of an alternate universe, but an alternate universe that may have been quite similar to Mary's upbringing, where she would have witnessed a lot of things that would have been really integral to who she developed into as a person. And then to leave that and never talk about that, and to become this sort of picturesque mother. And we don't know how much of that is actually what she was versus how Dean remembers her. But we sort of get the implication that she, at the very bare minimum, didn't talk about hunting, and that John wasn't aware of hunting. And similarly, we see with John that, we don't know a ton about his military history other than the fact that he was military, but how much of that also was I'm going to set this aside. And then once he picks up hunting, he becomes very militaristic. And that sort of becomes his identity as a hunter, is this sort of everything is very regimented. And we start to see comparisons to other hunters down the road, like Bobby, who lets the kids be kids. And John doesn't let the kids be kids. The kids are soldiers. If anybody gets to be a kid, it's Sam, and it's barely.
Well, and it's interesting because in that Dark Side of the Moon episode where we get a glimpse into Dean's heaven, John and Mary are at odds. John and Mary are fighting. And Sam says, guess you've been cleaning up Dad's mess longer than I thought, which I think is a very, if I were going to see favorite memories, it wouldn't be when my parents were fighting. So I thought that was either a constant or a really interesting cherry-picked memory that tells us a lot there. Now, we also have Bobby, who had a terrible upbringing. His father was incredibly abusive. His mother was not able to defend him. Bobby ends up actually killing his father. And we find out that he and his wife, Karen, the night she died, had fought about he didn't want children, and she did. And then he adopts two sons, and they grow up to be heroes, and is the one who can give them something of a childhood. That's got a big thing tied up in that big ball of attachment and everything we've been talking about. Bobby, what do you think? Lynn?
I mean, I think in many ways, Bobby is the father figure, the adult figure, the parent figure on the show that's meant to exhibit resilience. Bobby's meant to show the hope that, even though most of us wouldn't choose to be Bobby, but Bobby is a hopeful character. Bobby does transcend his terror of having children, which is really understandable when you've had a terrible childhood yourself. The thought of inflicting something like that on other humans makes you very reticent to want to have other humans yourself. So that was, again, this is supernatural, but that was very realistic. But Bobby kind of works through it. He's reticent in the beginning, but he sees that these children really need someone, and just the little tiny glimpses we get, again, he steps in there and he's able to be in a father role, and it becomes something that's like the pride of his life and a big part of his identity. I think we see Bobby's resilience in other ways too. He's in a wheelchair for a while, and he's resilient about being in the wheelchair. At first, it changes his identity. He thinks he can't go on, but he finds a way to go on, and he finds a way to still find purpose and meaning. And I think if they had left him like that would have been, I think he would have been fine. I think he would have showed us that kind of resilience. And who's at the very last episode of Supernatural sitting in the rocking chair doing okay in heaven? It's Bobby, sort of the ultimate, like, this is resilience. Here he is. He's still the wise old guy telling Dean, don't worry, he'll be along. Go take a drive, relax, do whatever. So I think Bobby is a little bit the counterpoint of some of the other characters who really struggle for a long time, and some that really don't don't think John and Mary really got a lot of resolution. I mean, John got some resolution in that 300th episode that he came back for, and Mary got some resolution in her arc that she returned for, but I'm not a huge fan of that arc, so I think she could have gotten more and it could have been done better. But Bobby really, he does get that nice resilient resolution.
Well, and for what we saw of Bobby's relationship with Karen, they seem to have a good marriage, other than that sticking point about having children, which is biggie. But he found someone, he took the risk on loving somebody and marrying someone. And except for the zombies, it seemed to work out pretty well. But she could make a mean cherry pie too, so that helped. Kaela.
I think something that also strikes me as part of Bobby's resilience is that he has a willingness to work on some of those things. I think part of why we see resilience with Bobby is that he is wise because he's done some introspection. He's often the one who calls out the boys for their lack of introspection, especially in the earlier seasons. And so while he may not have elected to have children, when he is presented with children in his presence, he's aware enough to know that they deserve to have childhoods, and that, maybe playing catch instead of going and shooting for the day is what's actually best. And so I don't think we get that without that willingness to be introspective and to, when I describe resilience to the folks that I work with in therapy, talk about it as you're presented with a roadblock, and rather than just sit down at the block, you get up and figure out a way to move around it, whatever that way might be. And I think that we get that because Bobby's willing to go, okay, like what you mentioned with the wheelchair, I'm in a wheelchair. I don't want to be in a wheelchair, but it's the situation I'm in. How do I move around this, as opposed to just give up?
Okay.
Which is so much of what Sam and Dean's journey also is, right? Oh, I'm confronted with a roadblock, a trauma, a challenge, a something. Do I run away from it and avoid it and escape from it in some way? Do I try to plow my way through it without even looking at it? Or do I finally step back and consider that it's there and maybe put a label on it and maybe think about what might be the best way I can get around it and who can help me? And maybe if I talk about it, then there will be allies who will help me actually, understand it. I think that, yeah, Bobby, that's his resilience. Yeah.
Well, and really the last relationship to talk about here in terms of all these things, the traumatic bond, the attachment, all of those, is Chuck, our Father who art in heaven. He's supposed to be a father figure. He falls kind of short. We know that Sam really tried to believe in Houses of the Holy, and somehow we got from Houses of the Holy to let's kill God. But any thought about how some of these issues also may have affected Sam and Dean's concept of any kind of higher power or relying on one? Because we'll throw Cass in there too. He kind of didn't get a fair shake when it came to believing and having that work out for him. Lynn?
I mean, Supernatural doesn't have a lot of positive stuff to say about organized religion. Let's just say that. I like that about it. I think it's a very interesting take. I think Sam and Dean initially have very different reactions, both to angels and to the idea of a god who turns out to be Chuck. I think actually the most interesting thing is that Chuck he sort of embodies that idea of a deity as a father figure. And what Sam and Dean's evolution is by the end of it, they don't need that father figure. They can go up against that father figure. They can see that father figure for the flawed creature that he is, and they can fight him off, and they're willing to be bloodied and beaten, but they're still holding each other up, and they're essentially saying, we don't need you. We have each other. We can count on our relationships that we have in our life. We can count on our own relationship. We don't need you. So there's a sense of, again, in the last season, that's part of Sam and Dean's evolution of being okay with who they are and okay with their relationship with each other and okay with what they've chosen to do with their lives and how they've chosen to do it. And they don't need anybody to pull the strings for them anymore. And they're willing to snip them.
Okay, Kaela?
I think there's an interesting parallel there too with the father-son relationship that Chuck has with Lucifer and Michael. When we first meet Lucifer and Michael, there are very clear parallels as to why Sam and Dean would be their vessels. By the time we get to the end, they're almost caricatures of themselves, where, you know, Michael, despite everything, remains the dutiful son, and Lucifer, despite everything, remains the rebel son that still plays into daddy's hand. And they're almost unrecognizable from Sam and Dean at that point, which I think, like you said, makes sense in that final confrontation of like, yeah, we no longer need you. The ultimate, you know, we're walking away and leaving you human. This is now our story.
Well, that is a terrific place to come to an ending here, because as usual, we have blown through our time. So thank you so much for a wonderful panel. Before we wrap up, let's let you tell us where we can find you online, and of course, mention those books. Lynn?
You can find me on pretty much all social media at Fangasm SPN. You can find the supernatural books, which include Family Don't End with Blood, and There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, at peacewhenyouaredone.com. And you can now pre-order Soups Ain't Always Heroes, the book that takes a deep dive into the boys, at well, now I'm going to forget the website, at smartpopbooks.com/the boys.
Very good. Kaela?
You can find me on AK Nerd Fighting on Twitter, or Always Keep Nerd Fighting on Facebook. That is a social media presence with Tanya Cook, who is the co-author with me on Fandom Acts of Kindness, which is going to be blurry. There we go. Fandom Acts of Kindness, a heroic guide to activism, advocacy, and doing chaotic good. Essentially a how to do fan activism. And that is available at all major retailers.
And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. All the social media is a variation of those. Spell them right and you'll find me. I run the Supernatural TFWNC group here on Facebook. I'm a columnist for the Winchester Family Business blog, but most of all, I'm here on Continual. So thank you both so much for a terrific panel. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There will be more Supernatural coming up soon. So we'll see you online.